Hello, and welcome to the Research 101 podcast series by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. I am Jennifer Garner, outgoing chair of the Academy's Council on Research. This series will provide an overview of the research process and provide information on Academy research opportunities. You can earn 1.5 units of continuing professional education by listening to all 6. During this first podcast, I will be interviewing Chris Biesemeier, who will share her advice on forming a research plan. Chris is Director of Clinical Nutrition Services at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, Tennessee. She is Editor-in-Chief of the Academy's Nutrition Care Manual and serves on the Board of Directors. She also chairs the Academy's Nutrition Care Process Research Outcomes Committee and has been active in the Academy's evidence analysis work, including membership on the adult and pediatric weight management, oncology, and bariatric surgery work groups. Chris, thank you for sharing your time and experience with us today.
My pleasure.
So Chris, for someone new to research, I would be interested to hear what are the initial steps you think they should consider before getting started?
Well, I would suggest starting by thinking of an issue that you see in practice and ask yourself questions like, what's the population you want to study? What is the nutrition intervention used with this population? What outcome do you want to investigate in terms of clinical effectiveness? And then brainstorm with the issues with others who work with you and come up with what's called a Pico question, or PICO. I've heard it said different ways, that defines what you're going to do. That would be P stands for patient population, I for intervention to be studied, C for the comparison intervention, which may be the routine care that you are already providing, and O is an outcome to study. Then make a detailed step-by-step plan for recruiting patients, clients, for data collection and also for data analysis. And then learn about Academy tools that can help via the available tutorials. And one of the best tools to use is ANDI. We talk about it all the time, but it's an acronym, ANDHII, and that stands for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics Health Information Infrastructure. Once again, ANDI. And ANDI can be used to collect data and also to generate summary reports, or a summary report, if you will. And so that's part of the planning process, is how do you want to collect the data, and then how do you want to see the data once you have collected it so that you can use the data, because that's the fun part, actually. So let's see, another key thing, let me say this, to determine if you're going to need funding, and if you are, how much you're going to need in terms of funding, and then kind of think a little bit about where some potential sources of funding might come from. And then, as I said earlier, determine the study design and methods, your hypothesis, and what it is you're hoping to achieve by doing your project. There are training videos on ANDI, ANDHII.org/info. And I think one of the things to also do when you're getting started is to practice with ANDI, get used to it, get very comfortable with it in order to get experience, and then, of course, you would move forward from there.
Great, that's helpful, Chris. So it's kind of a step-by-step guide to how you would think about the entire process. And I'm glad that you mentioned the Pico Statement. I think that can be a great way for people to organize their thinking around their project. And I would be curious, would you mind sharing an example of a project you worked on and just a rough overarching Pico for that? It can be very general.
Oh my gosh, I have a kind of a template, and I may go, let me share it with you. In patients with, and you could say whatever it is, heart failure, for instance, but whatever the patient population is, that's your P. What is the impact of, and you might say, sodium restriction or limitation, however you want to term it, and you might want to specify a certain amount of sodium compared with, and you would have your comparison group. So it might be, a comparison group might be the amount of sodium one group gets versus the amount of sodium another group gets. And then you want to then finish off with your outcome. So what is the impact of the intervention compared with using your comparison group on, and then it might be something like readmission to the hospital, or it might be something else along those lines, or it might be even something simpler like ability to follow a sodium restriction. So you kind of have to think about what's the issue you're trying to look at, and what do you hope to learn from doing this data collection project, and that will give you some good direction as to what kind of what your PICO question looks like. You want to keep it simple starting out, especially if this is your first time. You don't want to overwhelm yourself with a really complex project. Maybe a more complex project may be your next one, not this one.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one thing that I would like to ask you too about is the review process for projects. Depending on the setting in which it's being done, most research projects have to be approved by an organization's institutional review board. What should members consider considering a research project know about this process, and could you define that a little bit for them?
Well, I think that, and I'm very fortunate at Vanderbilt because our institutional review board, IRB, positions itself as helping people do research, and so they're a resource for us. And so I think really just asking them if you need to submit your project for approval is kind of a good step. So you may be able to go on your facility's website and find a link to the IRB and then indicate that you would like some assistance. But it's always a good idea. It's better to ask up front, and it may depend on what you plan to do with your data. If you're going to share it outside of your institution, it's likely that you will need some review by the IRB. Definitely make we'll add this from experience, make that contact with your IRB well in advance of when you actually plan to start your data collection to allow time to address any questions that might come up. And there will be questions. There will be time needed, maybe more time than you anticipated, and so by starting early, you don't have to worry that your timeline's going to be off. There will be forms, and IRBs may have a certain format, a certain tense, if you will, of how they want, like third person versus second person. They'll give you those instructions. There is something called expedited review, so it's possible that you might get kind of that quicker version of approval, and you might have a few forms to complete and submit, but you still would have to do that. You may, on the other hand, depending on your project, have a more intensive review, and that would be required for an intervention research project and also with certain patient populations. Follow all the guidance that you're given, all the IRB protocols, and it's very likely that you will be asked to save your data collection forms and will be given instructions on how long you are to save those forms, and so you want to follow along. Undoubtedly, also, you'll be giving reports to the IRB along the way, kind of check-ins, if you will, and also at the end of your project, you'll want to let them know, your contact with the IRB know that conclusion and how what all occurred from that. It's actually, I'm very fortunate, again, I will say, our IRB sees themselves as being very helpful in helping people be successful in conducting research, and that's always a positive.
Yeah, I think that the IRB plays such a crucial role in that way, and you're right, different ones tend to play that role a little differently. So could you elaborate for individuals who may be across various institutions or types of institutions, whether it's an academic institution or a hospital system? Overall, though, all IRBs kind of come to the same table with the same purpose. Could you talk a little bit more about, it seems like a burdensome process, but the IRB plays a really important role. Could you talk more to the broader purpose of having an IRB and having to go through all this rigmarole that you mentioned?
Well, I think from my perspective, as I understand it, you may even have some perspective on this too, Jen, but it's a matter of informing, getting an informed consent, or making sure that the people who are participating, if it is an intervention project, that they know that they are participating in research, and that their data will be collected. They'll also know how the data will be stored. It will likely be de-identified, so their names will not be used, but they're told this. They're told exactly what's going to happen, what the intervention is, and how the data are going to be used, and how their privacy will be protected so that we can learn information but not share personal information in a way that is identifiable to an individual. And that is more likely to result in that person saying, yes, I'd like to be part of this project. I want to help people learn more. And I don't necessarily want my name out there. Or that's kind of a concern that people have sometimes, is that the data will be able to be tracked back to them, and that's what the IRB ensures does not happen. So you can get a more successful data sample, have more people that you recruit actually can be enrolled versus having people say they don't want to participate, which just takes more time as well if you have to recruit more.
Right, yeah. Yeah, that all makes sense. And one thing too that might be helpful for anyone listening is a little bit of elaboration too on the forms that you mentioned. The IRB does, and I've been in that same boat. They require a lot of forms and tend to have a lot of feedback on your study design and all of your plans. Could you speak a little bit to all the forms and what kinds of forms the IRB typically wants from researchers?
Gosh, Vanderbilt is probably different, and I will say it's been a little bit of time, and I have mostly had expedited review. One of the things I'll back up and say is the Academy has multi-site projects, and so that's what we've done at Vanderbilt. The ones I'm thinking of, we've participated in projects, and we were one site of several or of many, but it's somewhat like writing a report. I mean, the forms are going to ask you what you're going to do, how you're going to recruit, how you're going to, all the things I said a minute ago, how you're going to collect the data and store the data. And that's particularly important. What kind of a database are you going to use? Who has access to that? How is patient identity protected? Those are basically the core of the forms, and then they'll want to see your data collection form, and that would be the form that you would obviously record your data on. So those are the main things. Like I said, fortunately, my projects have been primarily expedited review, and I have not participated in a major intervention research project here at Vanderbilt.
It sounds similar, though. I mean, I do have some involvement in that, but the gist of it, and I think the point for our listeners is that they really want to see that you've thought entirely about the entire research project in advance, and that you're able to state for them very explicitly what you're going to do at every step of the process, all of those steps that you outlined for us, Chris, right away. So I think that's it sounds like in your experience, and certainly in my experience, and we'll hear from other speakers as well perhaps about this too, about just really having to have a plan up front. So
one thing that's interesting is that at Vanderbilt, the projects I've been part of, my contact on the IRB actually did the presentation of the project to the portion of the IRB that we were assigned to, because there, can be very large IRBs and then with subsections. And I think that our listeners will want to remember that it isn't, and it hasn't been for me anyway, maybe there are some people, but you don't just fill it out, turn it in, and they go, thank you very much, this looks great. I have found that there's an opportunity for those questions to come up and suggestions. It might be better to state it this way, or have you considered doing something else that way? And so it is a process that is a back and forth for a period of time before the final approval is given, and that's why I said it a little bit earlier, be sure to allow plenty of time. But it's also, the whole time you're doing it, from my perspective, is exciting because you're learning as you go from somebody who has done this themselves and who has worked with the IRB, in our case, for a long time, generally speaking. So you really learn how to do things better. You can benefit from their experience.
Right. Well, I'm wondering then, what, as we kind of get close to the end of part one here, what advice would you give to a member who's intrigued by the idea of conducting a research project or being involved in a research project within the scope of their education or their work, but maybe are worried about having the time or the resources to complete it?
Well, I think you have to think about, I always say we need to be reasonable with ourselves. So we need to be reasonable and realistic about the size and the scope of the project. And it helps in terms of doing that if you're working with a patient population and an intervention that you're already working with. Though it doesn't mean you can't do something entirely different, but if it's something that you're familiar with, that makes it a little bit easier, especially for the first time. It is good to have other dietitians working with you. So involve colleagues, other dietitians and colleagues that can be part of the project. It's important to make that plan, as we talked about, and that a timeline. It's also important if you're working on a job, to get the approval or the coordination with your supervisor so that they're aware of what you're doing. And then what you're doing is kind of going to need to sell, if you will, or market your project in terms of what it's going to do for your organization or your department. The plan is important. And then from a personal what's in it for me standpoint, you might want to think about how is this going to benefit your career. Does your organization allow project days? We do have project days at Vanderbilt, fortunately. Not lots and lots of project days, but we do have some project days for each dietitian. And so if your organization has a project day, that might be a day or two you could use. Or if they don't have project day concept, is this something that your supervisor would consider? And last of all, we do have a career ladder, a 4-level career ladder, and so this project that you are working on or coordinating might be a way for you to demonstrate a higher level of performance to advance on the career ladder, another way to achieve professional development.
Great. This is really helpful, Chris. We really appreciate you sharing your wealth of expertise with us today. And so I just want to say thanks again for being a part of this series.
My pleasure.